if every person on the planet could feel what I felt during that experience on mescaline, this world would be a kinder, gentler, more empathetic place. On certain levels, objectively, you look at my life, and I think a lot of people would think it's ideal in so many ways. I went to university, I went to law school, I have had an interesting and pretty successful career. I've got a beautiful wife, I've got 2 healthy children, I've got a great job, I've got a nice house. But in the same token, I've struggled with a lot of things. What happened in my life is that my parents split up when I was 2 years old. And from the point of about 6 or 7 onwards, I had 0 contact whatsoever with my father. And my parents' divorce was ugly. And it was so acrimonious that at one point when I was still an infant, my father had kidnapped my brother and took him to Las Vegas, and grandparents and my mom had to send in the police, and I think the FBI were involved. You know, another time there was an attempted kidnapping when I was about 7 years old from my father. It just goes to show you like the level of drama and acrimony that went around my parents' divorce. So after that, from the age of about 7 until I was 13, we had security living in our house all the time, 24/7. It does affect and skew, you know, your perspectives on life. And one of the consequences of all this turmoil growing up is that I went from junior kindergarten straight into grade 1 because the school I went to didn't have room in senior kindergarten, which was the appropriate age group for me. But it meant that I'm not a big guy at the best of times. I'm 5'8.5". But at that time, I was a small kid, a year ahead of myself, and I was an extra small kid in that class. And being the small kid, I think defined a lot of my growing up and how I looked at the world. Being the small kid, it also taught me, or at least I interpreted as such, that I always had to overcompete, that I always had to work harder than everybody else. Like the negative sides of those experiences is that I learned to control my emotions. And so, you know, control is not really a good thing when you're thinking about your emotions. Like being able to navigate them and express them at appropriate times in appropriate places is one thing, but I didn't do that. I just kind of bottled it up, shrunk it down, and held on to it like as hard as I could. Over the course of the last almost year, I've been working on a documentary about psychedelics. And the first stop was in Costa Rica at a retreat called Holos. And I felt really uncomfortable. I felt like I was kind of wearing 2 hats, where I was the documentarian, you know, the producer, but I didn't know what I was doing there. And I was also a participant, but I wasn't really a participant because I had to wear this other hat. And so on the first night, I found myself aware for the first time of doing something that I've always done, which is having 1 foot in and 1 foot out, which was like I was part of the community that was forming for this retreat, but I was still on the sidelines. And it was a pattern that I saw emerging over and over throughout my life. And I was like, oh my God, I had no idea. And so going into the experience, my intention, the curious thing, the thing I was looking to understand, unpack, and hopefully transform was, why do I do this? The retreat involved 2 experiences, first with psilocybin and one with mescaline. And I won't say much about the psilocybin experience, save for it really got into a lot of the shame I felt and like a lot of the lack of self-worth that I've carried my entire life. I still do to this day. And so like it opened me up so much. And so going into the experience with mescaline, we started the mescaline process, and I'd never experienced mescaline before. It's happening. They're leading us through the ceremony. At one point, Samantha, who is leading the ceremony, turns on music and makes us get up and dance. And if there's one thing that I feel so uncomfortable doing, unless I'm very, very drunk, is dancing in public. Like it's just like so deeply uncomfortable for me. Inspired in part by the mescaline and the feelings of like self-love and warmth that had been coming up, in part by like, Jesus, I'm making this documentary, I better participate. I get up and I start dancing. At one point, Samantha asks us to stomp our feet on the ground. And so I start stomping my feet up on the ground. And one of the awareness that came from that experience was that I felt like a soldier. Like I felt like I was like marching in beat, right? And what I realized is that I've never felt like a soldier. I've never felt strong. I've never felt capable. That I've always felt small. All my life I've always felt like I had to do more just to be equal, just to be good enough. You know, I've always been mentally tougher than a lot of people because I had to be. I always had to do more than other people. I always had to be the guy who worked harder, or, you know, went to the gym and had to work out more, and so it was a pretty eye-opening experience, realizing that I'd lived my life this way, always being hyper vigilant. As that ceremony continued, one of the other participants, Daniel, who was down there with us, at one point I looked over and so I see Daniel standing up on like the edge of the shala, just looking out, and you could just like see him beaming and like absorbing the majesty of the moment. I go up and I just put my arm around him, and then Monique, who's now one of our physicians at Field Trip, but who I just met there, came up and she put her arm around me, and then Hannah, the facilitator, came up and put her arm around Daniel, and we just all stood there looking out. And the intensity of love and acceptance that I felt in that moment was more than anything I felt in my entire life. And it made me realize, I remember like writing down in my notebook how much joy, how much laughter, excuse me, how much love, how much sadness, you know, and hurt I've never let myself feel, always trying to hold it into that little ball, and how much life I was missing out on. It was definitely one of the most beautiful experiences of my life. As the ceremony winds down and the direct effects of the mescaline start to wear off, I start to go deeper into this exploration. And one of the things that came up was that the shame and that I felt, like the lack of self-worth, was somehow related to always feeling small and having to overcompete. But the other thing that came up, and I describe it as kind of like turning a page in life, but unintentionally opening up a whole new book, was that part of the reason I feel so uncomfortable in group settings and always have one foot in and one foot out was that because through the experience with my dad and always being taught that my dad was a bad guy and not to be trusted, through the experience of, and I should have mentioned this before, but through the experience of always being the small guy in school, getting picked on by my so-called friends and often being teased and pushed around because I was always the small guy, I've developed a healthy distrust of men. And so it's not actually that I feel on the outside of all groups. It actually involves feeling on the outside and never feeling safe in a group of men. And that was profound, you know. 43 years old, almost 43, I guess I was 42 at the time, and realizing that like most of my life I've never trusted men. You know, since then, it's now been about 6 months since that experience. That's starting to shift. It really is. It's changed me in so many ways, you know, not just the not trusting men thing, but starting to work through that feeling of being small, you know, and feeling unworthy or not good enough. It's affected all of my relationships throughout my life. And now moving through that shame, it enables me to like be more present and be more available and be more loving and feel safer in every relationship I have in my life, with my kids, with my wife, with my friends. And it's enabled me to be more responsible so I can respond to situations instead of reacting to them. And that's made a huge, huge impact on my life. So, what does integration look like from this experience? Spending a lot of time meditating, journaling, recognizing more when I'm doing falling into old patterns and trying to shift it, keeping in touch with people, certainly just keeping up with them and being part of the community and talking when I'm feeling stressed or unlovable or unworthy. Just revisiting that moment, whether in meditation or just shutting my eyes or just thinking about it or reading the notes I wrote down, helps me bring me back into that experience.